Hey, what's going on, everybody? Back with another how-to. Today we're going to be replacing the front and rear brake pads on this 2017 Nissan Maxima. Now I'm also going to be demonstrating removing the rotors, although we won't be replacing them because they're actually in good condition. But this should fall in line with any 8th gen Nissan Maxima, which is 2015 and as of right now to 2021. So let's get into it now. All right, so we are at the front wheel here. So the first step, of course, is going to be removing the wheel. So the lug nuts are a 21 mil. I just have a 21 mil on an impact. And we're going to fire all 5 of these right off. All right, so we have our wheel off, and now we have access to our brakes and all the components we need to remove to get these pads replaced. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull the wheel. You're going to have to have both sides jacked up for this, but I'm going to pull it. And as you can see, I'm turning the wheel, and I'm turning it so we get better access to our bolts that we need to remove in order to get our caliper and the bracket off. Now I'm going to be using an impact, and this will create more room for an impact, but of course you could use a wrench or a socket wrench or anything of that nature. So let's go ahead and start and get this brake caliper off. All right, so the brake caliper bolts here are 14 millimeter. Now I'm just going to take an impact. I'm going to shoot these 14s right off. One loose. Go to the bottom one here, loose. Just going to back them out with my finger. Should be able to get these both out. Got the bottom one there. All right, we got the top one out. So caliper is now free. All you got to do is take your hands. I'm going to rock this thing right off. All right, so there's the caliper, and what I like to do to get it out of our workway is I'm going to hang it right on the bottom of the strut assembly. So just make sure it's there nice and tight, and that's a good place to keep it from flexing on the brake hose or hanging unnecessarily in the way. And one thing you do want to be careful of is when you take off the caliper, it does have these retainer clips here. Sometimes they will pop out and fly when you take the caliper off. In this case, they actually stayed intact, but as you can see, there is both of our retainer clips. So I want to go ahead and remove them since they didn't go flying. All right, so let's put them to the side, and then we should be able to pull our pads right out. All right, so there's both of our old brake pads. So let's go ahead and remove the caliper bracket now. All right, now I'm only replacing the pads in this job because these rotors are actually in pretty good condition, but just for the sake of this video, I'm going to go ahead and remove this bracket and the rotor just to show you guys how to do it and give you insight on the full service if you need to replace the rotors or get them off. And while I have it off, I'm going to clean up the brackets and do that type of stuff since I'm going to take it off. But the bracket is held in with 2 22 millimeter bolts. I'm going to do the same thing we did with the caliper bolt. Just going to take an impact here, fire these right off. All right, got both of those broken loose, and I'm just going to back them out by hand, and then we're going to go ahead and remove our bracket. All right, so we're taking this last 22 mil bracket bolt out. Just be aware that once you take that bolt out, this is free. It could just fall, so make sure you're holding on to it when you remove that last bolt, and then you can completely remove the bracket from the knuckle. All right, so now that we have the bracket removed, the rotor is free. Now, in our case, we're lucky and this rotor is free. As you can see, I could just slide it right off. You know what I mean? I could just take the whole thing and remove it off of the hub. But if you're having trouble and it's actually rusted to the hub, which is typically what is going to happen because after a prolonged rotor being on there for a while, it starts creating a rust weld and it'll be on there pretty good. So you could take a rubber mallet, something like this. You could get this from Harbor Freight. This one's seen better days, as you can see, but all you gotta do is give it a few light whacks around the body of the rotor and it should free up that rust, and then it'll be free and you can rock it right off, just as I did with this rotor. But now that we have that off, we're going to go ahead and brake clean everything. We're going to clean everything up, and then we'll get into the reassembly. All right, so we got everything brake cleaned. I got the hub and all that cleaned up, the bracket and the caliper. So our next move here is going to be retracting this caliper piston. So there's a couple ways you can do this. There's a few different tools. You can even use some big vices, you know, pliers, whatever. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. What I'm going to do is take the rear pad, put it right back in place, and I have a 6-inch C-clamp, and we're just going to slide this over, and we're going to retract that until it's flush. So let's go ahead and get this C-clamp lined up, and we're going to go ahead and retract that piston. All right, so I just have this set up here, resting on my knees. As you can see, the C-clamp is right there on the back bolt where the brake hose bolt goes right into the caliper. And I have this dead center right here, so I'm just going to go ahead, start cranking this thing in. Just be careful to not go crazy. You don't want to overdo it, press it in and warp the boot or anything like that, but we're just going to lightly press this until it gets flush. All right, so it's pretty much flush. You don't need to go any farther than that. It should be more than enough space to slide over these new pads. So we got this retracted. Go ahead and remove our C-clamp, and then we can go ahead and get into the reinstallation. All right, so we have that brake caliper piston retracted. I have the caliper up here resting out of the way again, resting on the strut assembly, so we can go ahead and get into the reassembly of everything. So we're going to go ahead and start with sliding this rotor back on the hub. All right, now keep in mind I am reusing the old rotor, but obviously if you had a new one, you would be sliding the new rotor on. This one was in good condition, so we are reusing it. And one thing I like to do to keep this from flexing and moving on us while we're reassembling everything, because it is loose now, we are going to take a lug nut and thread it back on, and I'm just going to lightly tighten that down just to hold it in place while we put everything back together. All right, so that is nice and tight now. The rotor won't flex while we're reinstalling all of our brake components. So let's go ahead and get into putting the brake caliper bracket back on. All right, so rotor is on. As you can see, I have this brake caliper bracket cleaned up. I am reusing the old hardware. Typically, if it's not twisted or misshapen or anything like that, I'll just reuse the old hardware that was already in there. Got it cleaned up pretty good. One thing we do want to check before we put this bracket back on is to ensure that these slide pins have play. Now, you can re-grease them. You can get grease and pull these right off, but both of these actually feel pretty good. They got a lot of play and they're not frozen or stuck or anything like that. So just check these before reassembling everything to make sure that you have the play you need and ensure that these are both moving freely. So let's go ahead and get this bracket installed. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead, slide this right back over the rotor, and we're going to go ahead and align our bolt holes up on that knuckle. Got our bolts, and I'm just going to start these by hand, of course, and start getting them finger threaded in. That one's in. Let's get this bottom one in here. All right, both of these are started. I'm just going to get them pretty much finger tight, and then from there we're going to torque both of those to spec. All right, so we have both of our 22 mil bracket bolts tightened by hand. All right, so both of them are pretty much flush and in there. So we're going to go ahead and torque these to spec to ensure they're perfect. Now the torque spec for these 22 mils is 107 foot-pounds. All right, so I got my torque wrench here locked in at 107. So we're going to go ahead and get both of these torqued to 107 foot-pounds. All right, bottom one's locked in. Let's get this top one here. All right, both of those are now locked in at 107 foot-pounds. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get our new pads installed here. So I have a new pad. What I wanna do is take a little bit of brake grease, and we're gonna put this right here at the contact point where it makes contact with the shims. We're doing this to help prevent any brake noise. All right, so do the other tab on the other side. You don't gotta go crazy, just a nice little coat where it makes contact is fine. So got that greased up. I want to go ahead and pop this in the front here. Just going to drop it in and then press it right into the shim, and that front pad is now installed, and we're just going to do the same thing for the rear pad. All right, so we got that back pad greased up, and that's installed as well. So both of our new pads are now installed in the bracket. So what we're going to do now is take this caliper off of our strut mount resting place, and I'm going to put a little bit of grease along the piston and a nice coat of grease right here, just to give it a nice little coating between the contact point where the piston and where the front of the caliper meets on the pad. So let's go ahead and get this greased up now. All right, so I have the grease on the caliper. I just have it gently resting right here for right now, out of the way, because what we need to do as our last step is get our retainer clips here installed into the pads, and we're going to have to hold the pads while we slide the caliper over in order for these things not to fly out. So as you can see, it's already moving. So I put that one in, so I'm going to hold it in place. Let's get this upper one in now that we got that bottom one installed. Oh, yep, see, look at that. Flying right out. All right, guys, got that held back in. So what we're going to do is take our caliper. We want to lean the piston side up against the rear to create pressure on that back pad. All right, so it doesn't come flying out, while keeping pressure on the front. Now we should be able to slide this right over like that, and that will prevent those retaining clips from flying out. All right, so now that we have the caliper slid over, one thing we want to do is make sure that our guide pins here are in the correct orientation. Like I said, remember to make sure they have play, but we want this round part to be on the top, so the line here might be hard to see, but there's an inner line is going to align with that flat line on the side of the guide pin. So this one here needs to be turned into the correct orientation. And there we go. That one's pretty much aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and start these 14mm bolts in, and then we're going to go ahead and torque them to spec after. All right, and as you can see, that pin is right there in that correct orientation up against the caliper, and we're just going to go ahead and seat this finger tight. All right, there we go. We'll get this bottom one finger tight, and then we'll go ahead and torque it to spec. All right, got those finger tight, so we're going to go ahead and torque both of these 14mm to spec. Now they are 25 foot-pounds. All right, so these 14mm caliper bolts are 25 foot-pounds. Got the torque wrench here locked in at 25. All right, that one's locked in. Let's go ahead and get the bottom one here. All right, both of our 14mm caliper bolts are now locked in at 14 foot-pounds, so we are good. We can go ahead and make sure we have no noises. Pull on the caliper, make sure everything's tight. Spin this a hair. I don't hear anything. So what we're going to do is just turn the wheel back around, and we'll go ahead and get onto the rear. All right, we're onto the rear here. So same thing, 21 mil to get these wheels off. So all right, so we have the wheel off now. We're going to go ahead and start with getting the caliper off. Now, just like the front, these are 14mm. These are actually slide pins. So we're just going to go ahead and take a 14mm and crack these loose. Now, you could use a wrench. You can use a socket wrench, breaker bar, whatever you want to use. I'm just going to put a socket on a long extended half drive wrench, and we're going to crack these right off. All right, so I have my 14mm socket on there. Got that one cracked loose. Go ahead and get this upper one now. And we got that one moving as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead, back both of these 14mm out, and then we're gonna slide the caliper off. All right, we got both of those 14mm caliper slide pins out. All right, so now our caliper should move. As you can see, we can slide this right off, and to get this out of our way safely, just kind of like what I did in the front, we're going to rest this right here on this control arm. All right, so that's just going to be right there. Just make sure she's sturdy. All right, out of the way. Now we have access to our bracket and our pads. Go ahead, pull the pads right out. All right, we got both of our pads out. So now we are going to be removing the rotor as well. So we're going to go ahead and get these two bolts right here holding the bracket in right out. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get this bracket off to get access to the rotor. Now there are two 19mm bolts here. That is what's holding the bracket onto this rear knuckle here. So for the bottom one here, I'm going to take a long extended half drive ratchet. We're going to break that one loose, and then we're going to sneak a little one in here for this upper one, because there's not a lot of playroom with a deep socket or some other big headed socket wrenches up against this control arm. So let's go ahead and start with this upper one here. Just got to get the right angle on it. All right, so as you can see, I got a small 19mm on a long extended 3/8 drive. So, all right, got that one going. All right, so now I'm going to the bottom one here. It's got a longer half drive. I mean, I could use the 3/8 as well, but this is just going to be a little bit easier. Yeah, this is a little bit easier to break it loose. A little bit longer extension and a thicker ratchet, but there we go. We got both of these 19mm bracket bolts loose, so we're going to go ahead and back both of these out, and we're going to slide the bracket off. All right, we almost have this bottom bolt out here, and then both of these bolts will be out. And remember, the caliper bracket is now free and loose, so be careful because it can fall. Just going to slide that right off and put it to the side. And now we have full access to the rotor. And unfortunately for us, this one is not going to come off because it is welded onto the hub, it looks like, with the rust. So I'll show you guys how to get this rotor off, and then from there we'll go ahead and put everything back together. All right, so the rotor is not going to freely come off and just slide off as it should typically, and as it did in the front, because it is rust welded to the hub. So what I'm going to do is just take this 3-pound rubber dead blow, give it some light wax, and that's all it takes, guys. It took 2 whacks. We can slide this thing right off. Now, keep in mind, you want the e-brake not engaged, because this will hold the rotor on if you're trying to remove it if you have the e-brake on. So make sure the e-brake is off. But there we go, guys. That's how you remove a rotor if it's stuck on there. Just a few light dead blow whacks, and I'll still be able to reuse this rotor. Still clean, and that dead blow won't damage anything because of the rubber coating. So rotor's good, rotor's off. Let's go ahead and clean this up. Alright guys, so we got everything brake cleaned up, everything's wiped down, including the caliper. So what we're going to do before we start reassembling everything is go ahead and retract this caliper piston. So I'm going to go ahead and put this right here up against the dust shield, sturdy as I can. We're going to go ahead and drop our rear pad right back into the caliper, and we're going to take a C-clamp just like we did in the front, and we're going to slide it over, get that mounted in the back, and we're going to go ahead and start cranking this thing on. Alright, you can see she's going in smooth. This might not always be the case if it's frozen. You can take a little bit of heat with a torch lightly and heat the body up, something like that, but it's going in pretty smooth. Should be more than enough. Let's take this off, and she looks pretty flush, guys. So we have that retracted. Let's go ahead and get into the reassembly. Alright, so we got everything cleaned up here. Piston retracted, so let's go ahead and get this reassembled. We're going to go ahead and start with our rotor. Slide this thing right back over the studs on the hub. There we go. And we're going to do the same thing we did in the front. I'm just going to take a lug nut and then lightly fire that thing on for some stability as we reassemble everything. All right, so rotor is locked in. Let's go ahead and put the bracket on. All right, rotor's on. We have the bracket here. All right, so we're going to go ahead, slide this thing right over the rotor. All right, just make sure you're holding it on nice and tight. I'm going to go ahead and take one of our 19 mils here, start it off. We're going to start with the top here, hold it in. Go ahead and get this bottom one threaded in now. All right, so I got both of these started. So I'm gonna go ahead and finger thread these the rest of the way in, and then from there we're going to torque these to spec. All right, so we got both of our bracket bolts here, finger tight. So we're going to go ahead and torque these 19 millimeters to spec. Now they are 62 foot-pounds. All right, so got my torque wrench locked in, 62 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get this 19 millimeter bracket bolt in. All right, bottom one locked in. Let's go ahead and get this top one. Might be a tight fit here. Let me see if I can sneak in from the other side. Yeah, barely. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get this top one locked in. All right, top one's locked in, guys. So we got both of our 19 millimeter bracket bolts torqued to 62 foot-pounds, and now we can go ahead and put our pads in. All right, so we got our new pads here. We're gonna do the same thing that we did with the front. Just take a little bit of brake grease here, and we're gonna put it on the contact points where it's gonna contact with the shim. All right, so we're just going to do these tabs on both ends. All right, don't got to go crazy, just a nice light coat. So now we're going to go ahead and slide this thing right into the front. And there we go, guys. Front pad is installed, and we're just going to do the same thing for the rear pad. All right, we got both of the pads installed, all greased up. And we're just going to do the same thing for the caliper here. So I'm going to lightly rest the caliper right there, resting on the bracket and the dust shield. And we're going to take a little bit of this brake grease here. Just going to put it right here on the front contact points. And then we're going to put the rest here right around the piston area. All right, so everywhere this is going to make contact, it'll be nice and greased. All right, and there we go, guys. That is ready to be slid right over the pads. All right, so we got this all greased up here. Let's go ahead, slide this thing right over the pads here. Just be careful of the boots. You don't want to knock them off of the bracket or mush them or anything like that. So just make sure you get them aligned for when we slide our pins back in. So a little bit more adjusting there. Should be good. Now for our caliper pins, the 14 millimeters, these right here, we're going to clean them off. All right, nice and clean. All right, and I'm going to take a little bit of caliper brake lube. All right, and we're just going to run it in there, and I'm going to lightly spread this all the way out across the entire body of the slide pin. All right, just trying to get it completely. So we're just trying to get it completely covered. All right. So the one without the rubber boot is the bottom, which is the one I have in my hand. So go ahead, get that one started in there. All right, and I'm going to do the same thing for the top one. Clean it off. As you can see, this is the one with the rubber boot. I'm going to put the lube on it. We'll slide this in, and then we'll get these torqued to spec. All right, we got both of our 14 millimeter caliper slide pins finger tight, so we're going to go ahead and torque these to spec. Now the torque spec is 32 foot-pounds. All right, so same deal as last time. Torque wrench locked in, 32 foot-pounds. All right, top one's locked in. Just gonna get this bottom one. All right, it's locked in as well. So we got both of those locked in, and we are completely reassembled, guys. Just want to make sure you got some nice play on those slide pins. All right. Look good. Don't hear any crazy noises when spinning the rotor. Everything looks good. Everything is reassembled and intact. So I hope this helped with changing the front and rear brakes on your 8th gen Maxima. Make sure you stay tuned because you never know when I might be wrenching on this thing again. And until next time, guys.